of other passages, particularly in the prophets, that elaborate upon that time frame. And one of the clues that we get to seeing some of those things is usually you'll see the phrase "in that day." So typically, the phrase "in that day" should kind of clue us in that it's talking about that time frame of the return of the Lord and kind of the events that follow thereafter.
And what's interesting about studying this is, and I think it's kind of cool, is that the more you look at the millennial kingdom, the more you realize how normal it is. And what I mean by that is, like, if you think about, like if I just think about going to heaven, like it's super vague and I can't really latch onto it, but there's going to be many of the natural processes that God made that he's going to keep, that he's not just going to trash that idea that he had initially. And I remember, a few weeks back, we kind of talked about the difference between Greek philosophy versus a Hebrew worldview, and how the Greeks kind of view the physical or the material things as bad and spiritual things as good, but like God made all of it. He made the earth and the heavens, and he called it all good. And so kind of in light of that, it's important to understand that there's natural processes that aren't just going to go away when we have resurrected bodies or when Jesus comes back. He redeems creation. And one of the ways that we see this in the New Testament in particular is when Jesus is resurrected and he's walking around in a body and he's still like eating, he's still like hanging out, but like he's just popping through walls. Like there's elements of his body that are very natural, and it's kind of what we're used to. And then there's some that are obviously very different. So I think that the millennial kingdom will be very similar to that, because all of us in creation will kind of undergo a similar process. One of the things that I think is really cool is that Romans ties the groaning of creation and just the bondage that creation has been under because of sin, like unwillingly, how they tie creation's liberation from bondage also with our redemption, the redemption of our bodies and with our resurrection. And so it's amazing that like God's promises are not just for us to come to life, but for renewing the entire earth as well. So jumping down to Roman numeral 2, why is understanding the millennium important? I think it's super helpful to know where we're going. So we're encouraged to have hope. In Corinthians, we're told that if we have hope in this life only, that we are to be pitied. And then Hebrews also exhorts us to hold fast to the hope that's set before us. And I think when you have something tangible to hold on to or to hope for, I think it's very helpful. And like, this is kind of this is where the details like get exciting when you kind of look at specific scriptures and you focus on a certain aspect of the millennium, because at least for me, like being a more detailed person, that helps me to latch onto, okay, this is what it's going to be like. And this is kind of a silly example or analogy, but so sometimes Priscilla has taken it upon herself to bust me out of my like routine, because I would just like do the same thing every day, and I'll just kind of be like happily doing the same thing, and she'll be like, we're going to go somewhere new. And I'll be like, I don't want to. And then she'll be like, no, we're going somewhere new. And I'll be like, okay. And then she'll show me pictures and she'll be like, well, they have this and they have that. And the more she describes it, then I'm like, all right, fine. Like, let's go. We can do this. But I think in the same way, sometimes like we do that to the Lord with this earth. Like the Lord is going to take us somewhere new, like not physically take us forever and ever, but like he's bringing the whole earth into a new season. And sometimes I think it's really easy for us to be like, but God, I like it here. Like I'm very like comfortable in this. Like I'm very settled. But ultimately, like I think that's why I love looking at the little nitty gritty details in the scriptures and just knowing like where things are headed, because it makes our hearts excited for what's to come. Another reason it's important for us to kind of start thinking about the millennium, and even for us, you know, like it's something that like you guys can kind of take into the prayer room, like take some of these scriptures, even from the notes, and just kind of like dive into one of them during your prayer room time. But one of the reasons it affects us is because if we understand that we're living for the age to come, it definitely has an impact on how we live now. We see this like in natural life. There's students that like, if they are in high school and they know they're about to apply to college, they're going to try to strive a lot harder than somebody who's like, I just need to get my degree and get out of here. Like, I'm not going to college. Like, there's a totally different mindset when you understand that like, oh, my actions now have consequences on what comes next. And the same is true in the way that we live now, and then what kind of life we get to experience or what kind of rewards we get to experience in the age to come. Like, it actually matters. And that, I think, is super important, because sometimes we just think about being saved and we're like, well, it's it. That's a one size fits all kind of a thing. But actually, like, it talks about us having varying degrees of glory. And like, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So there's a few verses I just want to look at. So in Luke chapter 12, Jesus says, "Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that do not fail." And I think it's interesting that the way he encourages his disciples to give up everything is by telling them, it's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. When we look at the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes in Matthew 5:5, when Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," that's not some sort of an analogy or a spiritualized thing. Like, the meek literally will inherit the earth. And will be rewarded as such. And we kind of see this theme as well in the parable of the talents. So, the servant comes to the Lord, and Jesus, if you guys know the parable, he either rewards or chastises them based on how they've been faithful with little. So, but the reward for the servant who is faithful is that he said, because you have been faithful in a very little, you shall have authority over 10 cities. Like, that seems like kind of an odd reward if that promise is applicable for, I don't know, just this life, or it's only like a spiritual thing. But like, Jesus actually promises authority in the age to come based on our faithfulness in this life. And another thing that I love to point out is that God actually enjoys rewarding us. And I think that's so interesting, because like, sometimes we have this like overly, I don't know if it's like an overly religious or an overly spiritual of like, oh no, like I can't do things for a reward. Like, and it's true in the sense that Jesus is ultimately our inheritance and he is our exceedingly great reward, right? But God himself is not above giving us rewards. Like, he actually enjoys it and he promises it to us. And it's beautiful to me to see, like, if you look at the churches in Revelation as an example, they don't all get the same reward. Like, Jesus gives one reward to Ephesus if they overcome in the area of not losing their first love. Right? He promises they get to eat from the tree of life. And then he says something different to Smyrna. It's like, all right, if you're faithful unto death, you will receive the crown of life. Another thing, to Pergamum, where Satan's throne is, he's like, if you overcome in this issue or this area of idolatry and immorality, I will give you some of the hidden manna and a white stone with a new name on it that no one else knows. And so it's just kind of beautiful to me to think about, different, like, if you guys think about different times in your life where you maybe had to put Jesus above your family, or you had to lay something down, some sort of sacrifice, like for the kingdom or for his name, big or small, like, I actually think he rewards us based on that. And I think that that's so encouraging. It's almost like when you have like a special souvenir or a trophy from a particular event and you're like, oh, I remember that. Like, I feel like the rewards that the Lord gives us will be similar, where he's like, I remember when you did that. And we will likely have forgotten most of those things, but he's faithful to reward it. As we see in Matthew when it says, whoever gives one of these little ones even a cup of cold water, he will by no means lose his reward. All right. So moving on to Roman numeral 3. So one of the biggest things that's going to happen during the millennium is that Jesus is going to restore the kingdom to Israel, and Israel will also experience national salvation, both physically and spiritually. So we've, I think, talked multiple times about how in Acts, when Jesus came back from the, he's raised from the dead, he's teaching the disciples for 40 days about the kingdom. He didn't correct their view or their question when they're like, well, at this time, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Didn't correct him, right? So that expectation still stands that he's going to do that. And it's beautiful to think about the way that God is going to fulfill all of his promises and all of his covenants. So Israel will actually be the first nation to be saved in totality. Like all of the remnant of Israel that's left after the tribulation, we know God's going to preserve a remnant. They will know the Lord. Now, I love some of these verses just, in Jeremiah and Zechariah that kind of describe how he's going to do that. And just the spirit of grace that he's going to pour out on them so that they would mourn when they realize who he is. If you move on to the top of the next page. So the Lord, as we said, is going to save them physically and spiritually. So this is, kind of the time frame when we see God make good on all of his promises. So all of the covenants that he's ever made to Abraham, to Isaac, all the promises that he made, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, covenants he's made with David, they will be fulfilled largely in this time frame. And God is going to make, he's going to make it so that they do not backslide anymore. It says he'll heal them. He'll save them from all of the backslidings in which they have sinned and cleanse them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. Which brings us to letter D. So God is going to regather Israel a second time. And why on earth is he regathering them? Because if you look at it now, they're already kind of partially regathered, right? It's amazing that the Jewish people right now as a nation have been brought back from all over the world, revived a dead language after thousands, of years. But this time God is bringing them back because they've been exiled one last time in the final chastisement. They've been thrown out of the land one last time in the tribulation, carried off into captivity to all these nations. And it's interesting because some of these passages actually in Isaiah describe people from all of these different nations. So all these nations that are mentioned here are largely in the Middle East or North Africa. But they're actually going to bring, so some of the people that survive the tribulation are going to bring the Jewish people back to Jerusalem, to the Lord, which is just kind of a wild picture. And then I think a couple weeks ago, Joseph talked about the desert prophecies, but letter E, Jesus is going to come back largely similar to a greater Moses leading a second Exodus. And a lot of the language that describes his return just has a lot of similarities to the Exodus in the way that he's going to actually deliver his people and lead them back up out of captivity, back up to Jerusalem, which is a really beautiful picture. If you've seen videos, in World War II of soldiers liberating concentration camps, it will be similar to that, except for the Lord is going to defeat all of Israel's enemies. And he's going to gather and heal his people. We've talked a lot about his throne being in Zion. So Roman numeral 4, what will his reign be like? It will be a great reversal. So right now, most of the people that are powerful in the earth are not humble and they're not righteous. I think there was something on the news today about like the zoo, like the Columbus Zoo guy, like got into trouble for some sort of like, no, it wasn't Jack Hanna, but it was like there's so many scandals. It's like, oh my gosh, every company, every politician, it seems like, not every single one, but the majority of them are corrupt. And the majority of the people in the earth right now that, if you think about the persecuted church, even in like Iran or somewhere, that they have no political rights, really. Like they are by all means politically oppressed. Jesus is going to humble the proud and exalt the humble. And I love Isaiah 2 says, the haughty looks of man shall be brought low, and the lofty pride of men shall be humbled. And the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. For the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, and it shall be brought low. Another aspect of what it will be like when Jesus is reigning is that nations will actually go up to Jerusalem to learn God's ways from him directly. So it's kind of cool to think about that, because like we've, how many of you guys have traveled, hours or, flown somewhere, driven somewhere for like a conference? Like most of us, right, have traveled for just to get like a glimpse of like some aspect of Jesus, or just to be able to touch his presence. And it's amazing to think about the nations going up to Jerusalem to hear from him and to actually learn from his ways directly. And another interesting aspect of his reign is like, so we know that a lot of evil will be curbed because he's going to rule in righteousness and justice. But then at the same time, you have this weird factor of like, so in Zechariah 14, it describes what will happen if any of the families of the earth don't go up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles to worship the king. And it gives like specific punishments of like, there's going to be no rain, this plague's going to happen to them, whatever. And so there's in that, like it's indicated or assumed that there will still be people alive that are not believers. Like they have the ability to like choose not to go up and worship God. So there will still be some people that are alive on the earth at this time. And we see in Isaiah 13:12 a description that like, you look through Revelation and it's like a quarter of the earth dies from this, and like large chunks of people. It says in Isaiah that I will make people more rare than fine gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir. But there will be a remnant that will kind of repopulate the earth in that time frame. So there's going to be resurrected saints, but there's also going to be people that don't know the Lord kind of coexisting in the same time and space under the reign of Jesus. Flipping to the top of the next page. So there will be a greater level of holiness than what we have known. This is so encouraging and comforting to my heart. Because I feel like you cannot walk outside, like you can't walk downtown and see something that's not broken. Like I can't, like my favorite coffee shop, Lord have mercy, is the most, like they've got every color flag you can think of, and it's just very, very clearly like they just hate Jesus. And so like sometimes, you see stuff like that, and it's like there's even benign things are defiled, like in the present age that we're living in. And so I don't have this verse in the notes, but like, I think it's Zechariah 14, also talks about at the very end of the chapter how like even the bells on the horses or these bowls, like everything's going to be holy unto the Lord. And I love thinking about how in the New Jerusalem, Revelation 21 says, nothing unclean will ever enter it, nor anyone who does what is detestable or false, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. Like it's hard to imagine a world that is like untainted and undefiled by sin, but like, even in the midst of some rebellion, like there is going to be a progressive like aspect where like the earth is becoming holy unto the Lord again, and we will not have these unclean things any longer. Another thing that's kind of interesting to think about is letter E. There's going to be a process for the way that Jesus kind of plays this out or works it out. And I know I think most of you hopefully have had a chance to buy like Joel or Travis's books, but like I love their books because they talk about these processes and all the details. But it's interesting because after the final battle, like at the end of the age, it actually says that there's so many bodies for the people that resisted the Lord that they're going to bury them for 7 months. Like that's a very long time. And it even has, like Revelation, I think talks about a more specific cleanup process where the birds of the air are invited to feast on the flesh of kings and of generals. And, but it's interesting because it actually says that they're going to make this memorial here. There's going to be this will be remembered that this is where these people are buried. Like, and you'll see it if you're going through there, like you are going to see it. And the Lord is actually going to allow some of those things to remain in the age to come as a reminder for us. All right, Roman numeral 5. So we get to reign with Jesus. Hallelujah. I just wanted to look at a couple of the scriptures in here. So Paul would have had a foundational understanding of the saints reigning with the Lord, possibly from places like Daniel. So in Daniel, it talks about the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. So Daniel kind of has this indication that there's some sharing between the saints of the Most High and the king in his kingdom. And then we see Paul, like when he's writing to the Corinthians, he must have talked to them about this, about reigning, because he says to them, like, and would that you did reign so that we might share the rule with you. Like he's basically saying, look, you kind of jumped ahead of yourselves here, but I wish you were right. So we were reigning and ruling together. And then he goes on and a couple chapters later, and he's kind of correcting them for not being able to settle disputes amongst themselves. And his logic behind rebuking them is, do you not know that we are to judge angels? How much more then matters pertaining to this life? In Matthew, Jesus told his disciples, this is on the top of the next page, truly I say to you, in the new world, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So it's entirely possible that in the millennial kingdom, like the 12 disciples are going to be reigning and like leading the 12 tribes in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because when you think about like judging in the Bible isn't always just judging right from wrong, but like if you think about the judges, like they actually had other roles too. So it's just kind of an interesting side note. But additional Roman numeral 6, additional purposes of the millennium. So it will be kind of this progressive reversal of the curse. So things in heaven and things on earth will be joined back together. The Lord is going to put an end to war. This verse in Isaiah is kind of cool because it says, he shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples. It's interesting because like right now, like between nations, there's really not like a good mediator. Like you have, the UN in some cases trying to mediate between nations, but they're really like, the Lord is actually going to be the one to step in and settle disputes for many peoples, which is kind of a cool thought that Jesus will settle those matters on a macro and micro level. There's also going to be a period and a process of rebuilding the earth. So if you think about like how devastated the earth is going to be after all of the judgments, after all of like man's sin and God's wrath. Like there's going to be like, it's going to look rough, like unrecognizable, I think. But we get to have a process in rebuilding the earth in some way, which I think is so cool. Cause like sometimes here even, you know, all of us will chip in for like projects on Workday and stuff like that. And it's so satisfying to finally build something in for it. Like when the gravel pad was done, it was like, yes, like praise the Lord. It's just so satisfying to see it done. But even that, like, it's not going to last forever. You know, like we won't be here forever to enjoy it, but like we get to rebuild something that's lasting. And I think that's very exciting. There's also going to be healing of the natural land. So I think, how many of you guys have swum in the Dead Sea before? Janine, don't do it. It would be too hot for you. You would for sure pass out. Jeff has sprinted into the Dead Sea. So this passage in Ezekiel actually describes water flowing from the temple into the sea and causing this seawater to become fresh, and reviving everything in the sea so that it can live. And I like this little detail in verse 11. It's like, but the swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They are to be left for salt. Like, that's just so, like, I don't know. That's just so amazing that the Lord thought of that. He's like, well, everything but that, like, save that for salt. Like, I love that. Let's see. Yeah, we kind of talked about not laboring in vain, but if you think about these things, so a lot of these are reversing the curse, the initial curse that was brought into the earth after the fall. There will be restoration in the animal kingdom. So the wolf and lamb, the doggos and Bartface will graze together. The chickens will live happily. So there's aspects of creation that we don't even recognize are broken that God is going to bring back into a right order. One of those things also is just the healing of our bodies, but also extending the lifespan. If you think about it, like our lifespan was shortened at the flood. Like God had to put a cap or a limit on man's sin. And so it says that if a young man will die at 100, and if a sinner dies at 100 years old, they must be a curse. Like that, the Lord is going to extend lifespans again in that time frame. Again, just of the people that are living there on the earth. So we don't know what that will look like exactly, but not as much sickness and like just the effects of things that we've done to our own environment or our own bodies. Like it will not be able to harm us as much in that time. And then Corinthians talks about how the last enemy to be destroyed is death, and Jesus will reign until he puts all his enemies under his feet. So I think it's interesting to think about that kind of being a process that God will reign until all enemies are under his feet. Okay, so in Roman numeral 7, I would like to just say that there's some things in Revelation that are like big events, like Satan being chained up or being released from the bottomless pit. And then you see that there's actually a time frame when he's released and he deceives the nations one last time and he brings them to march on Jerusalem. But this is different than like the final end times battle because it has a very different outcome. They're not successful at all. Fire falls on them from heaven instead of, you see in other passages that describe and like the battle against Jerusalem, you see that the armies that approach Jerusalem are very successful, and they carry the people off into captivity and they ravish the city. So this is one final battle. We also see in the millennium that at some point the dead are judged. So there's the first resurrection and the saints rise, and then at the end, all the dead rise and all the dead are judged, and either some go into the lake of fire. So it's the book of life or not. And then at some point, and this is where these are the events where I think there's enough debate amongst scholars that I don't particularly have a clear grasp on the time frame of this. But at some point, the New Jerusalem is descending, and some people think that that's at the end of the millennium. Some think it's more in the beginning. But either way, it's coming down. And then the Father ultimately returns, and all things are brought together. So that, I'm not going to get into any of the details on those particular topics tonight, because I feel like there's a little bit more to be understood or to dive into there. But I think that the important thing to take away is that the timing of it is important, but it's not as important as like that we know that it's coming, essentially. Like, we know that there's a time when like the glory of the Lord is going to be all over the earth, and that the Father will dwell with us again. So I think what we can kind of close with today is maybe share, just like in small groups. Jefferson, if you could type these up, actually. But maybe share, like, what is one thing that you're most looking forward to about the millennium? So one thing you're most looking forward to could be a positive thing. And then the second question is very similar to it. So these things may or may not overlap. But what is one thing that you're like, I can't wait for God to fix this? You know, be it death or like a particular injustice. So those two questions. So what's one thing you're most looking forward to? And then what is something that you're like, I can't wait for this to be over. Like, praise God that this thing is going to be no more in the age to come. So find a friend and kind of share amongst yourselves, and then we'll regroup maybe in a couple minutes if we have a little time for Q&A.